Erev everyone. It is my zechut to join you once again. I was thinking for this evening, I want to continue our, again, my mandate from Israel over here was to speak about the days, and the journey between Pesach and Shavuot. So while Sira and different aspects of Sefirat HaOmer are our subject, I don't think that if we're talking about the days and our journey from Pesach to Shavuot in Yerushalayim, Yirach Kodesh, I don't think that we can get away with not discussing, as we did last week, Yom HaShoah, discuss this week, at least Yom HaZikaron. I wish that I would have an opportunity to talk about Yom HaTzmaut also, because it's a whole different story, but I thought maybe a little bit about Yom HaZikaron. So, what do we know about Yom HaZikaron? Yom HaZikaron is, you tell me, what do we know about Yom HaZikaron? It's always what?
The day before Yom HaTzmaut.
It's always the day before Yom HaTzmaut. That's the most recognizable aspect of it. And today it's Israel's National Memorial Day, where we come from in the U.S. Memorial Day is a day of barbecue. Memorial Day is really like a summer day off from work and from school, and families get together and they barbecue. And the truth is, I'm a grandson of a veteran of the United States Army, but most people that I know, the United States Army is relatively small, and since World War II, it's not like in Vietnam, I guess, it's not a common thing for everybody to know somebody that was in the Army. So as Memorial Day, I don't know what it was like 50 years ago. You can tell me if it was the same. These days, it's not much of a Memorial Day. There's not that much memorializing doing.
Exactly the same.
Yeah, okay, so it's always been the same. So Americans celebrate, or commemorate the way the Americans know how to do with a barbecue and good cheer, which is, there's something to be said for that. I'm not going to completely denounce it. But one of the things that was very striking when I started spending my years here after high school was to recognize that Memorial Day was really Yom HaZikaron was really a day of national mourning. There's, the way one of the sources we referred to last week about Yom HaShoah, that in Bayit Asher Ein Sham Met, that's really the case in Eretz Yisrael. We are really one big family, and whenever there's a tragedy, it's so rare that if you don't know anybody involved, usually you know 1 or 2 degrees removed. I know somebody that knows somebody that was involved. That's the norm here, and there's also universal conscription, and everybody goes to the army, and which means that everybody, if you didn't have experienced tragedy in Tzahal, almost everybody knows somebody that did. Everybody has a comrade in arms that fell or was injured or maimed in some way. And last year we made Aliyah. This August will be 2 years. So last year, as an Ezrach Yisrael, last year was my first opportunity as a Toshav of the Yeranana, and I went with my oldest son to the Tekes for the city, and it was really one of the most powerful experiences I have had in my short time here. They listed off every single casualty that from Renana on a board. The Rosh Hayir got up to speak. There was a choir that performed, and what I was just looking around me, just all of my neighbors. A few people I knew, most of the people I did not. It's a big city, Renana, Yerushalayim, but there's 100,000 people in the city, and everybody was bunched together, and everybody was solemn and crying and serious about. It was such an intense experience, and I knew already in my earlier years, but I felt much more palpably last year that the extent to which it really is another day of mourning, Yom HaZikaron, and it's a day of mourning that is I get this feeling that it's a day of mourning that's necessary and appropriate, but it's a day of mourning nonetheless. And to really take a day and stop and think is something that actually I think is profoundly Jewish. The idea of observing Yartzites. So, nowadays, at least among Bnei Ashkenaz, Yartzites are a day where you bring a l'chaim and some cookies to shul, and everybody makes a bracha to in memory of the deceased. But classically in Jewish tradition and halachic sources, the day of a Yartzeit was actually a day of mourning, and a day of reflection, and a day of avilut. And the customs it was basically a small recreation of the experience that you had after the loved one that you had that was lost. And I think that's really what Yom HaZikaron has become. I think with the classic individualized Memorial Day just on a national scale. And it's a very, very, very powerful day. And the fact that it's done in proximity to Yom Ha'atzmaut is even more powerful. Yeah?
Rabbi, I don't know if you've been to the Herzl Military Cemetery.
I've been a couple of times, yeah.
Okay.
So I've never been on Yom HaZikaron. You need status to get in on Yom HaZikaron.
Every soul that has died on that particular day, they said Kaddish.
Yeah.
It's the most moving ceremony. It's
you have to understand, we'll move on in a second, but my experience last year wasn't, I've seen lots of lists of names of casualties of victims of terror and people Chaylim that have fallen in my years here. There are a lot of memorials. Unfortunately, there are many of them. What was so powerful wasn't the reading of the names. Well, that was something. It was just looking around at everybody. All of my neighbors at the time. I've never been in a room and in a space of such palpable and gushing emotion. So again, made a very, very serious impression on me. I can't say that I'm looking forward to Yom HaZikaron this week in like a classic sense, but I take it something that I continue to take very seriously, and I consider it to be a privilege to be a part of it now. Okay, so why is Yom HaZikaron on the 4th of Iyar, on the day, or I should say, why is Yom HaZikaron the day before Yom Ha'atzmaut? Most of the time, after the Rabbanut has played with the date of Yom Ha'atzmaut for many years, and it's actually, it's only about a third of the time, as things stand now, that we actually have Yom Ha'atzmaut on Hey Iyar and Yom HaZikaron on Daled Iyar. But the idea, and it's all because of Chilul Shabbat. We'll get to that actually in a few minutes. But this year it happens to be that Yom HaZikaron is going to be on the 4th of Iyar and Yom Ha'atzmaut is going to be on the 5th. So why was Yom HaZikaron chosen for the 4th of Iyar? So the simple explanation, which I think is, I think everybody understands intuitively, and doesn't really need to be, it's not a big chidush, is that Yom HaZikaron is there for us to recognize what the cost of Medinat Yisrael is. And were it not for this tremendous, heartbreaking sacrifice that has been, has been put on the altar of the Jewish people for these last, this last century, including the years before the Medina, where we were fighting for our survival. Were it not for all of that, blood and sweat and sacrifice, Medinatenu Aktosha would never have come to be. That's certainly the case. But there actually is an interesting and I think profound backstory to Yom HaZikaron that developed very organically, but very bottom up and not necessarily top down. It wasn't a fiat by the government that was declared immediately. So let me start with a couple of things. I think source number one is what I would consider to be what I would consider to be actually a coincidence. So you'll tell me if you think it's a coincidence. But source number one, what I did for this week is I tried to grab as many as I can from like the original clippings of these itonim, of these newspapers from the 40s and 50s in the early days of the Yishuv, in the Yishuv and in Medinat Yisrael. So number one, so we're looking at a clipping from Davar, and this is May of 1940, and you can't see it, but in the bottom left corner of the letterhead, it says that the Orech of Davar was, can anybody read it? It was Berl Katzelson. Anybody know who Berl Katzelson was? Sure. Berl Katzelson was a very, very important leader in the labor Zionist movement, and was the one person in his life that Ben Gurion, David Ben Gurion, our founding, Rosh HaMemshalah, it was the one person that Ben Gurion considered to be his Yedid Nefesh. Ben Gurion, I mean, it's a little odd, but Ben Gurion had Kathelson's picture on his desk his entire career. He was the one person, and if you know anything about Ben Gurion's history, we can, maybe a subject for another time. But Ben Gurion was a little bit of an irascible, cantankerous fellow who constantly saw both real and imagined, threats and enemies from all sides. Right? His feud with Menachem Begin was famous. Again, just a couple of blocks from here, they had some legendary, sniping at one another. They used to, Ben Gurion used to refer to Begin as the Chavar Knesset sitting next to, and there was the guy that Begin's seat was next to. He wouldn't even name him in his. So Ben Gurion was, like, again, a very cantankerous, irascible fellow And the one person that he actually had warmth for was this guy, Burl Castleson, who died very, very young. But Burl apparently was a brilliant political leader and an organizational whiz. And among other things, what he did was he edited and founded and edited Davar, which is you see is the Iton Polei Eretz Yisrael. It was an organ of the labor Zionist movement. Okay, so why am I bringing this clipping from 1940? Long before Hakamat HaMedina, I guess, as World War II is raging. Because if you know anything about the back history leading up to 1939, which is when the white paper of the British government was issued, which is what barred the gates on the eve of the Shoah for Jews to get into Eretz Yisrael, what was the thing that led to the white paper of 1939? Anybody know? There was a series of events that happened between 36 and 38, known as the Arab riots of 36 to 38. Okay, there were several of them, and this was an ongoing problem. There was the British, when they started the mandate after, in 1920 and 1921 in the San Remo conference, the British thought they were going to be getting a whole lot of good out of their stewardship over the land of Israel, and they thought that they would be doing good for the Jews and Arabs here in the Middle East in general. That was it was the best laid plans of mice and men, right? I believe that they had good intentions, and in fact, the British really are the ones that brought the land was rotting for 5 centuries under the Ottomans, and the British really are the ones that brought Eretz Yisrael into the 20th century. They're the ones that laid the first, electrical grids they built, and roads they built, and they built railroads. A lot of the infrastructure that Medinat Yisrael was able to use at its founding was built in the 30 years that the British were here. So the British, they ended up biting off more than they can chew, because they took a conflict, they took a very difficult and tense situation of Arabs and Jews both laying claims to the land of Israel, and they thought that they would be able to mediate. They thought they'd be able to pacify, and in the end, they made nobody happy. So by the time we got to the 30s, the Arab, which is exactly the point. I don't want to get too far afield here, but this is like in one of his many prophetic statements, Jabotinsky, he claimed that as soon as the Jewish population in British Palestine, in Mandatory Palestine, reached somewhere in the 30 to 35% range of the population, that's when the Arabs were going to no longer consider Jews a minority that could be controlled or dominated, in the long term, and that's when they're no longer going to be able to tolerate Jewish presence here. He said that decades before it happened, and V'kach hava, in 1936, there was a census, and that was the exact point at which the Arabs finally realized that this growing Jewish population was something that they could no longer tolerate, and that was when riots started. And there were all these claims. You can read these clippings from newspapers. There were all these declarations and proclamations about how Jews were usurping, Arab land, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We know this history. So it was a very bloody few years. So why am I mentioning this? Because in the 1-year anniversary of the final massacre of 1939, of 1938, 1939, of the 1-year anniversary of the final bloody event that ended the Arab riots, a suggestion was published in Davar that on the 4th of Iyar, which was the anniversary of that last attack, we establish a Yom HaZikaron for these riots from 36 to 38, which is fascinating. Now, I consider, in all likelihood, I think that was really just a glaring coincidence. But, who am I to say what's a coincidence and what is not? But it was, it's there for us to read. Liyishuv, right? This is a letter to the Yishuv. Yom HaShanah le'ma'orot ha'tafresh tzadi vav shemavet Nisan. Right, 1 year since the occurrences of 1939 that happened in Nisan, Chodesh HaGeula, the month of redemption, Nitchel Dal Diyar, Yom Zikaron Gvurahu Liyishuv HaIvri Ba'aretz. It should be a day of remembrance of the bravery of the Yishuv, of the Jewish Yishuv in Eretz Yisrael. Yom Zeh, and so okay, we'll leave it at that. So again, I think that's fascinating. I think it's prophetic, but it's interesting that already years before in the Milchamat HaShechrur, there was already at least in some corner of Eretz Yisrael, it was on the consciousness of Toshavei Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so that's the first of two very, I'll call them prophetic suggestions. The second one, I'm sorry, I messed up the numbers here, everybody, so you'll forgive me. In the bottom right corner of page 1. The second one was something that was a suggestion made in a kibbutz meeting on kibbutz Tirat Tzvi by a guy named Avraham Yitzchak Merchavia. Okay, and we know about this because there were minutes taken. There was like a newsletter by kibbutz Tirat Tzvi. Kibbutz Tirat Tzvi, by the way, is in the lower Galil. It's like near Beit Shan.
Beit Shan. It's in the Beit Shan Valley.
It's in the Beit Shan Valley.
Yeah. So
it's right. It's actually like right north of the Green Line. On the northern part of north of the Shomron. So it's so kibbutz Tirat Tzvi, I think, was the first religious kibbutz that was founded in Eretz Yisrael. So it was a significant place, and you'll notice that a lot of these, we spoke about this last week, about Yom HaShoah, a lot of the remembrance initiatives were taken by the religious. And we can speculate about why that was. I think that it was people who were used to going to shul and saying saying tefillot. I think those were the people that most naturally felt an avenue, a window into how to concretize what was obviously a palpable national feeling. So this guy, Avram Yitzchak Merchavia, suggested on April 19th of 1949, he suggested, and the background for this was that I should give the introduction. The background for this was that the final armistice agreements were signed in the early months of 1949. Okay, so we are weeks and months since the Milchamah HaShachor is now over. Right, it then began. Were it only so that the violence ended? There was lots of violence, but at least we actually had recognized boundaries, not recognized by the enemy, but that we had borders for that were recognizable, and they were based on these armistice agreements that were signed. Okay, immediately after that, there were clamorings and discussions about how to commemorate. Israel was the Milchamah HaShachor, we don't appreciate it, but the numbers of fallen in the War of Independence were in the thousands. But when you consider the size of the yishuv, I remember once did the math. It would be the equivalent of something like in America now, like 10 million soldiers dying. Right, so imagine a war being fought by in the entire Afghanistan and Iraq wars, the numbers of American casualties were in the thousands. Right, imagine an American war being fought in the span of a year and a half, where 10 million casualties happened. Like that would be devastating, and that's what Milchamah HaShachor was. It was so long ago, and we're so removed from it. And the numbers, just the absolute numbers, are small when you consider wars. But if you consider the size of the yeshuv at the time, every single family had somebody that was on the ramparts fighting, and every other family had somebody that died. It was a travesty of the loss of human life. So immediately after these armistice agreements were signed, even before, there were discussions about how to establish memorial ceremonies. And if you look at the clipping, and I want to move on, so I limited this. But if you look at the newspapers of the day, there were announcements and memorial ceremonies by different local municipalities all over the country at different times. This one had had 30 members of its city that died in this particular operation. So on that date in March, that city wanted to do it, and this one was in May, and this one was so there were a bunch of these. So on the back of this, in the midst of all of this, Avram Yitzchak Merchavia makes the following suggestion: Al lanu liyot kfuyei tova. All right, and he's going to be referencing something that we're going to be talking about a little bit more extensively in a minute. So it's not becoming for us to be ungrateful. Samuch la Yom Ha'atzmaut haya Yom Etzion. All right, Yom Ha'atzmaut, next to the day of Atzmaut, which was a year ago in May, not 11 months previous in May. Right next to Yom Ha'atzmaut was what he calls Yom Etzion. Ha'im lo kedai l'shalev et ha'devarim. Does it not make sense to connect Yom Etzion and Yom Ha'atzmaut? And asala atzia she'ikoyam Yom Etzion be'yoto se'ah ve'akravat ha'am legeula. We should, I want to recommend. And again, he was recommending to the local kibbutz council in Tirat Tzvi. He wasn't saying anything nationally. This is just an idea that was eventually publicized and caught on, or at the very least he was capturing the sentiment that people understood. So he wanted to capture, he wanted to suggest that Yom Etzion be tied to, at least in Kibbutz Tirat Tzvi, he wanted to suggest that it would be tied to Yom Ha'atzmaut. מתוך כך חולם הוא להיות אזכרה והתייחדות כללי לכל הנופלים על מזבח השחרור. Right? So he wants to establish this day of Yom Etzion to commemorate the people that died on this horrible altar. Also because this day was connected to Yom Ha'atzmaut. It is on the backs, it is on the toil of the fighters of Etzion that our Atzmaut happened. Okay, so this is what is he referring to? What do I know? On May, right? So on the 4th of Iyar, on the day before independence was declared, is when the 4 settlements of Kfar Etzion, of Gush Etzion fell. Okay, and more on that story in a minute. But Merchavia was specifically referring to the same way that everybody in the country, so many different people in the country, were looking at different tragedies that happened throughout the war and saying we should establish a memorial day based on those days, based on that tragedy. Merchavia looked at the fall of Gush Etzion that happened the day before Yom Ha'atzmaut, connected it based on the sacrifice of the people that died, more on that in a minute, and connected it to, and said explicitly that it was on their backs that our independence was established. So the question is, was he saying something that was a rhetorical flourish, or was he saying something more concrete? I don't know. I don't know the guy. I actually read a testimonial of his 20, 30 years later that he gave, where he was saying, no, he was really saying something much more ekroni. I'm usually a little bit more of a cynic and I'm skeptical, but let's see. Okay, so where we are right now is in 1949. These are suggestions that are being made. Okay, the war is weeks and months since it was over, and you have people all over the country who want to have memorials. And Merchavia wants to make a suggestion. I don't think that he knew anything about the Davar article from 9 years earlier, but apparently there was already this sentiment somewhere in the country of Yom HaZikaron on that day for the Arab riots of 36 to 38, 36 to 39, and Merchavia suggests that we have a day specifically to honor the fallen of Gush Etzion. Okay, so a month before that, we have in Haboker, again, another one of these Itonim. What we have here is another fascinating description. We don't have to read it inside, but what we have here is, again, everybody is trying to figure out how to properly commemorate this national tragedy, this national calamity of the number of casualties from the war. And what this article describes is that there was a drisha of a group of parents of fallen soldiers that got together to basically throw ideas around that they were going to recommend to the Knesset. Okay, the Knesset is like 5 minutes old in March of 1949, and again, think about it. Imagine a group of grieving parents who are mourning the loss of their children, and the first thing they considered, the government was penniless. The government was extremely in an extremely tenuous situation security-wise. They had no allies. They had no way of feeding their citizens. They had no economy, and they had people flooding in from the Arab majority countries, Jews flooding from the Arab majority countries in the thousands, daily. And they had no way to feed them or house them or anything. There were a lot of problems in the early years of Medinat Yisrael, and these parents got together and they said, "No, stop everything that you're doing. We need to figure out how to properly commemorate the fallen from the Milchamot HaShechor." And they got together, and what the suggestion that they made is that we pick one day, and that day be the exclusive day of remembrance throughout Medinat Yisrael. Ad kedei kach that the government should try and forestall any other local municipalities or any other local groups doing memorials the other day. What was the idea? And this is why I thought this was such an appropriate, again, we'll speak about this for a few minutes, why I think it's actually a really appropriate transition to what I'd like to speak about Sefirat tonight, which is the mourning practices. The feeling was that the best way that we can express our atzmaut is by having our atzmaut and our mourning reflect some sense of togetherness. And this has been, the great project of Medinat Yisrael before Medinat Yisrael was Medinat Yisrael, which is how we take a bunch of Jews from all over, from 79 different countries that people have made, Jews have made Aliyah from, how to take people with customs and cultures that in some cases are thousands of years old, that are wildly different from one another, and put them all together into this massive cholent and call ourselves one people. This is a very, a very tricky, challenging project. And, I've always been very moved by this first order of business after Hakamat Hamdina, after the establishment of the Knesset, when the first Knesset was voted in.
What's interesting is this very religious establishment that they were doing was not coming from a religious motivation. That's the beauty of it all.
So if you read this, we don't have to read it inside, but if you read it, there was no identifying or naming of Dalet Iyar in this, which is why Merchavia gets credit. Again, not counting the thing from the Arab riots in the 30s. Merchavia gets credit for the one who was the first to name, even though this request that was published a month earlier, they didn't name Yom HaZikaron, the 4th of Iyar, as to be Yom HaZikaron. They just said, we want the government to pick one day, and that day be the day that be our national day of mourning. Okay, so that year, 1949. That year, 1949, there were memorials all over the country. I always assumed that Kibbutz Tirat Tzvi actually had they accepted Merchavia's suggestion, and they had the first Yom HaZikaron that was on the 4th of Iyar. On the first, just by the way, I don't think we're going to have an opportunity to talk about it. But Zrat Hashem, next year for Yom HaTzmaut, Rabbi Yisrael, we'll gather together for Yom HaTzmaut, and we'll focus on that. But the first Yom HaTzmaut is a fascinating subject. Oh my gosh. The tefillah, it's like the same thing here. The tefillah that was supposed to be established by the chief rabbinate, but Rav Herzog was out of town at the time, and it was like
rushed together.
It was rushed up together. All the suggestions for tefillot for Yom HaTzmaut, but Rav Uziel, who was the Sephardic chief rabbi at the time, the first Sephardic chief rabbi, wanted to put his stamp of approval on it and say this is to the extent that there's a gzera, tzava from the chief rabbinate. He wanted to do that, but Rav Herzog was out of town and he couldn't WhatsApp them. Right? He couldn't get in touch with Rav Herzog because this was a rush job to put this together. This tekes for tefillah of Yom HaTzmaut. So in the end, what was published, and it was very similar to what the popular tekes for tefillah Yom HaTzmaut that we have today. What was published ended up being a suggestion and not an established gzera or an established rule from the chief rabbinate, because Rav Uziel wouldn't do it without the agreement and unanimity with Rav Herzog, and because of that, it actually grew in a very inorganic way, because once it wasn't actually a ruling, not everybody did it, and then Rav Herzog came along and he actually contributed something a little bit different. And it's a fascinating history to that for another time. That was all in 1949. And it makes sense. Until a couple months before Yom HaTzmaut of 1949, the Medina was still fighting for its life. It was everybody was predicting that it was going to be a stillborn baby, that they were going to be overrun, and in the early months of the Milchama Shachor, it looked like they were going to be, and the fact that they were able to turn things around, there's again tons of history to this. It makes sense that it felt like minutes since the state was actually on a footing where they could focus on anything other than surviving. And now, it was a rush job to get Yom HaTzmaut and Yom HaZikaron and figuring out how to do this the right way. So all that made sense. Okay, so that first year, it was a big hodgepodge. Everybody was doing things differently. If you flip over to page 2 and turn it 90 degrees, I think the fourth of source number 1 that we have here. This is again back to Davar. Kathelson, by the way, is dead by this point. He did not live to see the Hakamat Hamdina. But you'll see it actually says Orcha Rishon Rel Katzelson, because he was a famous labor leader. So in Davar, it publishes that this is in April, so this is about a month before a month before Yom HaTzmaut that year. So in April they publish It was Chavav Nisan. Okay, so it's not. It was a couple of weeks before, a week and 10 days before Yom HaTzmaut, Yom HaZikaron. What became Yom HaZikaron. So that the paper publishes, and 10 days before Yom HaTzmaut, a Pekudat Hamatkal, What is a Pekudat HaMatkal? What's the Ramatkal? He's the chief of staff of the of Tzahal. Okay, so the Ramatkal, who I believe was Yigal Yadin at the time, so Yigal Yadin signs this order, and the Ramatkal has jurisdiction only over
soldiers,
only over soldiers and army bases. He's not a civilian leader. He has no jurisdiction over anybody else. But the first establishing of the 4th of Iyar actually came from the army. And what is, we can read it, what did the Pekudat Ramatkal report? Pekudat Ramatkal b'keva b'yom dal b'Iyar kol shana, yom lifnei Chag Atzmaut. So it's not just the 4th of Iyar, it's davka the day before Yom Atzmaut, b'yom hazikaron hakavua lechalalei tzava Yisrael. And this is going to be the established day of remembrance for the chayalim that have fallen, casualties of Tzahal. Ve'ein l'sader shum askarot tzava'iyot b'yom acher. So again, he has jurisdiction only over Tzahal, and he says that the army is not allowed to establish any memorial service or memorial day outside of Yom HaZikaron. Again, searching for that unanimity, searching for that, that achdut that is, sometimes so elusive around here. But he had that authority over the army. Hashana, and this is very interesting, the Yom HaTzmaut in 1950 is when it was the first balagan about Hey Iyar, and it's coinciding with Shabbat. So Hashana Huktam Yom Zeh Bigla, right? So this day of the 4th of Iyar is actually going to be Huktam. It's going to be earlier. Bigla Yom Vav v'Shabbat. The Yom HaAskara Nikva Leyom Ha-20th Be'April. Yom Ha-20th Be'April. So what happened in 1950? Hey Iyar was on Friday, and because this was the concern. It always is all of the rejiggering of the date for Yom HaTzmaut is because of the concern for Chilul Shabbat, and because of that, so that year it was Nidche, and Yom HaTzmaut was celebrated on Sunday. We don't do it that way anymore because but that year, in 1950, it was done on Sunday, and Yom HaZikaron, according to the Pekudat HaMatkal, was backed up to Thursday. So it was on the 3rd of Iyar was this day of Memorial Day that was established by the Ramatkal, and Yom HaTzmaut was going to be on the 7th of Iyar. Okay, so that's what we. So that again, if we're putting the timeline here, this was in April of 1950, and he says, "What are we going to do?" Or layom hey. It's a Talmudic terminology when we refer to the evening of a day. Or layom hey. So what that means is Wednesday night. Okay, so on Wednesday night, you'd like b'chol machanot hatzava, in all army camps, ner neshama, they're going to basically light a yahrzeit candle. B'yom hey, and on Thursday, tirachna b'chol hamachanot azkarot klali, digul, and then they were going to put that flag at half mast. Okay, so they were going to have memorial services, they were going to light candles, and they were going to put the flag at half mast at all army bases. So this was the jurisdiction of the Ramatkal, and that's what he did. Okay, so the first concrete establishment established, Yom HaZikaron being on the day before Yom HaTzmaut, or the 4th of Iyar, or whatever, even though it wasn't in 1950, was based on a fiat, a declaration by the Ramatkal. Okay, so that is in April of 1950. Also, what I have here on April of 1950 is the Seder HaTfilot B'Yom HaTzmaut. This is part of what I was referring to before. So we now, today, we can open up a Korean Sidur, we can open up Rinat Yisrael, published a Machzor for Yom HaTzmaut years ago, so we can look at it, open up a Sidur, and we see the Seder HaTfilot. There was no such thing, so how did everybody know what to daven? So they actually published it in a newspaper. How else is anybody gonna get the word out? So they actually published a Seder of Tfilot in April of 1950, and you'll notice that concomitantly, alongside in the same within a couple of days, 3 days actually after, and this is why this was such a rush job. Basically the Rabbanut and the Ministry of Datot, of the Ministry of Religion, took this and they ran with it, and they said, okay, this is actually a really good idea. Maybe they were doing it, they liked Merchavia's idea, maybe they didn't, maybe they were just going off of the Ramatkal, but 3 days later, published in Hatzofeh, so first is the Seder Tfilot Yom HaTzmaut, and then if you look down in the middle, Horaot L'Kfiyat Yom HaZikaron, this is in the middle, 2/3 of the way down in the middle column. Horaot L'Kfiyat Yom HaZikaron, the Chayalei something HaShichrur, right? So people who fell in the Shichrur. Mitam HaPikud Al Yom. Okay, so and then it goes through a bunch of memorializations, memorials that they were going to do. This which was published by the chief rabbinate and by the Ministry of Religion, of religions. So this actually is much more concrete and has has details about yartzites and kalmales, etc. But again, in 1950 was from starting with the army and then with the chief rabbinate and the Ministry of Religions. So that's when this day of Yom HaZikaron being established on the day preceding Yom HaTzmaut happened. So if you're keeping score, then so it happened very organically. We have some miskeret of this date from 1940, which is very strange. I consider that to be a coincidence, but it was too good of a coincidence not to mention. Then we have the 1949. We have Merchavia making the suggestion and he tying it to the fall of Gush Etzion. More on that in a minute. And then the following year, and we have all these other, we have a request by parents of fallen Chayalim who wanted this to be a day that was to be a specific day. They were put the question to Knesset, and as everybody knows, if you want anything done around here, the last people that you should be asking to do it is the Knesset. And instead, where this came from was Tzahal, and then the chief rabbinate. So it came from institutions, but not the elected legislature. That comes several years later. Okay, everybody with me so far?
Yep.
Okay, so if you look now on page 3, so this is now by the next year, all right? By the next year, if you look on, this is again a different Iton. This is Cherut, and this is from the following Yom HaTzmaut, Yom HaZikaron. So now we have the army's established date. We have the Tfilot and the Seder Hayom that was published by the chief rabbinate, and now we have over here. And Cherut published the following year, mamash 1 year later, in the weeks leading up to Yom HaTzmaut. So the 4th of Iyar, Yom HaZikaron HaKlali L'Giborei Milchemet HaShichur. And what I want to point your attention to here is that this is where we come back to Merchavia's original suggestion. Yom HaZikaron HaKlali, we're reading from the Cherut piece here. Yom HaZikaron HaKlali L'Giborei Milchemet HaShichur Yiyet Tzamud LaYom HaTzmaut. It is connected inherently to Yom HaTzmaut. V'yikava me'ata miyom shelfanav. Right, it is connected to Yom HaAtzmaut. I'm sorry, not to and that was the thing that was first articulated by Merchavia, and was not, even though the 4th of Iyar was mentioned. If you going back to the Kudat Hamatkal, even though it was mentioned that it was going to be the 4th of Iyar, the idea here is that it was tzamud now. It was inherently connected. So based on the Pekudat HaRamatkal, he doesn't go into the connection between the two things, and he doesn't even. For all we know, it's just at least in the way that the Yadin put it out. All it was a calendar thing. Everybody should know. The 4th of Iyar is the day before Yom HaTzmaut is a Yom HaZikaron. The day after is Yom HaTzmaut. But here in this now that this minhag has picked up steam. People were talking about the depth of this connection to Yom HaTzmaut, that it was tzamud to Yom HaTzmaut. It was inherently connected. Okay? And now this is actually being established by the Ministry of Defense. Right? Up until now, we've had the chief rabbinate, we've had the Ramatkal, and we've had the Ministry of Religions. Right? The Misrad Datot. Here, we're now the actual Ministry of Defense gets involved. Yom HaAtzmaut Yachol b'Shabbat is the head, and then it goes through the rules about it being changed and it being nidcheh. But what changes already now, different from 1950, is that we'll never have another Yom HaZikaron to Yom HaTzmaut like we had the previous year. And what's the proof that I'm saying that it's no longer, that it was in the first year it wasn't tzamud, it wasn't inherently connected. We had Yom HaAtzmaut came out on Friday, Yom HaZikaron was backed up, and Yom HaAtzmaut was pushed forward. But starting from 1951, the 2 days were always connected. One follows the other. Okay? And that's basically what we have today. The holiday that we have today. And you'll see the chok of the Knesset, which was passed years later in 1963, which is interesting. I don't want to get into it. I actually printed out and read through a couple of speeches from the Divrei Knesset, from the minutes from the Knesset about this, but I don't think we need to get into it. But you'll see again. This is just like we read the law from previously. Actually, one historical point about this. This was in March. This was passed in March of 1963. 2 months later, in early June of 1963, anybody know what significant event happened in the Knesset? Nope. Oh, maybe I don't know. No, that wasn't. It was 61. Ben Gurion retired in 1963. So this was one of the last pieces of legislation that was signed by David Ben Gurion. Now,
Levi Eshkol took over. What is it?
Yeah, so Eshkol was Ben Gurion's appointed successor, or Shkolnik, as he liked to call him. Ben Gurion wanted everybody to have a Hebrew name until he wanted to be not nice to them, and then he referred to them by their Yiddish name. So, but yes, he was his hand-picked successor and the head of the Labor Party. But Ben Gurion very quickly had a falling out with them. He started his own party. He thought that he would, after 1963, he thought that he would start Rafi, which is the Rishimat Poalei Yisrael. That was his own party that Moshe Dayan ended up joining, thinking that it was going to be the next big thing because of all of the heresies that he claimed the Labor Party had committed, and basically everybody considered him an old dotard at that point. Nobody really followed him. So he spent the last several years in the political wilderness. There's an interesting book about that. Not for now. But it's an interesting piece of history. One of the last pieces of legislation that Ben Gurion signed was the official declaration on the part of the Knesset, who, how many years later? So it was in 1949 the request was made. It was 14 years later that this was actually happening. And what are the pratim? So the 4th of Iyar is the Yom HaZikaron Gvura Lelochamei Milchamat HaKolomiyut B'Tzava Agna L'Yisrael Shenadu Nafsham Al Hakama Medinas Yisrael Ve'al HaBitachon Kiyuma L'Itachadut Am Zichram La'alat Maaseh Giberotam. Okay, so this 4th of Iyar is going to be the day of remembrance. Chal, the 4th of Iyar on Friday. Yikuyam Yom HaZikaron b'Yom Bet b'Iyar Shel Ot HaShana Chal Chamishi V'Shavua Yikuyam Yom HaZikaron b'Yom Gimel b'Iyar Shel Ot HaShana. Okay, so this law has actually been jiggered with and amended several times. Most recently, definitely in the 90s it was. It's like 4 or 5 times there have been amendments to this law. But the crux of it has remained the same. And the most recent change to Yom HaZikaron in terms of established law was in 2018 under the umbrella of what ended up being a very controversial piece of legislation that was passed as a basic law. Right? So Israel doesn't have a constitution. If you're familiar with the way the law in the state of Israel works, there's no constitution. What we have are basic laws, and basic laws basically are the grounding principles of the state that require, in order for basic laws to be passed, it's supposed to require more of a higher threshold to pass them, and I will refer you to all of the newspapers and heated debates that are going on right now, judicial review, etc. But in 2018, there was a basic law that was passed that was supposed to be the nation state law. It became known as the nation state law, and it had several provisions in which basically what the government was trying to do was concretize a number of principles that were already established either by law or by deeply held and deeply rooted tradition in Medinas Yisrael. That ended up being controversial, and its opponents called it racist. We're not going to get into this right now, but one of the provisions in this thing was to make as a basic law of the state of Israel that Yom HaZikaron is going to be the day preceding Yom HaTzmaut on the 4th of Iyar. So it's taken quite a journey from the strange, mysterious suggestion in 1940 to Merchavia in 1949 to the request of the parents of the fallen soldiers to the passage of it as basic law. So we can debate that law all we want, but it is part of Israel's basic laws, and Yom HaZikaron now is what at least on the books, is part of the core laws of Medinas Yisrael. Okay, so I wanted to just say a quick word about Merchavi's original suggestion, because I think there's something to it, and I think that for all people who love Eretz Yisrael and Medinas Yisrael, I think this is we all have a chiyuv to read this book. This is, I read it, I've read this like 3 times already. This is Benny Morris, who's a modern historian of the state of Israel. This is not without its critics, this book, but he was really the first historian that sat down and looked through all of the sources available to him, both on Arab and Israeli sources, and tried to put together some picture of how the heck we won this war in 1948, 47 through 49. Because it's, establishing it as as divine judgment is certainly something that I sympathize with and agree with. God works in mysterious ways, and there were explainable reasons why, about how things work and what happened. Okay, so in 1948, Benny Morris goes through the fall of Kfar Etzion, fall of the Gush Etzion. Gush Etzion was a series of 4 settlements. 3 of them were settlements by religious Zionists. The land was originally purchased in 1927, and there was a bunch of attempted and failed yeshuvim on this Jewish-owned land until the 1940s, when the religious Zionists moved in and they established 3, and then an additional, and then a 4th joined within a couple of years. So by 1948-49, there were about 500 Jews living in these 4 settlements of Gush Etzion. And if you look at your map over here, I'm sorry it didn't come out very well, but if you look at it, if you look at where Kfar Shishim is, I specifically did a topography map so you can appreciate why the Kfar Etzion, which was the biggest of the 4, why it was such an important and strategic spot. The space where Route 60 is, if you can tell, is really made in a valley. And if you know anything about warfare, right, so the easiest place to travel if you're traveling is going to be in a valley. The roads are always in valleys, but roads that are in valleys are extremely vulnerable to attack from high points. The only securely held Jewish land in this section, south of Yerushalayim, was Kfar Etzion, and they held it, and it was an extremely tenuous hold that they had on this. It was only a few hundred people that were holding it. There was at one point there was lots of children that were there. Eventually, the children were sent out of these 4 yeshuvim, and this ended up becoming, Tzahal saw it. There was a big debate about whether or not to give up on these settlements or to try and hold on to them. The mayor of Hebron, who was a significant political figure at the time, made a declaration that everybody should leave peacefully because the Arabs are hot and bothered by Jewish presence in all these in this area, and they're going to overrun you. And but if you leave now, you'll actually be. I can promise you. I give you my word that you'll be compensated for your lost property, because it was publicly acknowledged by everyone that this was property that was owned and deeded to Jewish settlement. So Tzahal, it was a very serious debate in the early days in the first moments after the Hakamat HaMdina and leading up to it, about whether or not Tzahal strategically should fall back to defensive positions, whether or not they should try and hang on to every scrap of territory that was controlled by Jews. Now, it would have made a much cleaner and much less bloody war if they had taken the first option of fallen back to more defensive positions. And from that position, the argument was that from those fortified positions, they would actually be able to solidify their strength and then go on the attack and push their solidified positions further. That was one school of thought. The other school of thought was that the Jordanian Arab Legion, which was the most sophisticated army at the time in the 40s of any of the Arab countries, and the reason why is because it was sponsored, trained, and equipped by the British Army. The British put a lot of energy and effort and capital into trying to establish Jordan as a legitimate state. It wasn't. It was mostly a bunch of desert, and they took a Saudi Arabian family, like they took the Hashemites, and brought them in here and said, okay, you're going to be the rulers over this spit of land. And then the people that were there, the largest contingent of the population in Jordan, ended up being refugees from the Milchamah al-Shachur. So this is why Ariel Sharon, for his whole, most of his career, until he had a little bit of an about face, used to say, we don't need Palestine. Jordan is Palestine, because it was this land that was majority of which was populated by Palestinians. So that was like the reality. Jordan had the most powerful army in the area. Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq. Those were all the other armies, the Arab armies that were involved in the War of Independence. None of them had an army that was as well equipped, as well trained, and as capable of causing as much damage as the Jordanian Arab Legion. Okay, why is that so important? Because the Jordanian Arab Legion actually was the only Arab army that was operating west of the Jordan River, right, in Israel proper, and what became Israel proper, before the Hakamat HaMdina. Right, the day after Israel was established, that Shabbat, all right, all of these armies invaded. Right, Egypt from the south, and Jordan from the east, and Syria. So the Arab armies invaded immediately. In the months leading up to the Hakamat HaMedina, though, the Arab Legion was operating within the area of west of the Jordan River. Okay, now why is that important? That is really important because everybody knew what was going to happen. Everybody knew that as soon as the British left, they were not going to be breaking up any more fights, and it was going to be a free-for-all, and whoever could grab every piece of land, called the Alim Gvar, whoever reached and controlled this property, it was going to be part of their territory. And the Jordanian Arab Legion was trying to put themselves in position to take everything, and not only to take everything, but also to put themselves in position to invade. And holding off the Arab Legion was an essential strategic goal in the months leading up to Hakamat HaMedina. Before, again, the intractable, impossible problems here were, I can't even imagine what it was like for everybody sitting around the table. But that was strategically important. Now, if you want to hold off the Arab Legion, who was operating in Midbar Yehuda, and they were operating south, and you want to basically the main goal was to cut off their ability to withhold their ability of attacking and conquering Western Yerushalayim, where the biggest concentration of Jewish settlement was in the whole country at the time. Right, there was some 120,000 Jews that were living in Western Yerushalayim at the time, and holding on to that territory was essential. Yerushalayim, being part of Medina Israel, was essential. It was a founding principle, which was basically done with a lot of chutzpah in the face of international pressure to not do this. If they wanted to hold on to Yerushalayim, what they needed to do was keep the road that the Arab Legion was going to take to Yerushalayim. They needed to keep obstacles on that road, and the best possible way to do it was to maintain the only spit of land that they had that was on high ground, overlooking what is now today Route 60. That was the road that was leading north to Yerushalayim. That was, in a nutshell, right? I'm no military strategist, but as I understand it, that was the intractable, insane situation that the Chayalei Tzahal were in, and the government was in the early months after Hakamat HaMedina, and the months leading up to Hakamat HaMedina. So, because of that led to the decision to hang on to Gush Etzion. It was a small number of settlements that were surrounded on all four sides by enemies. But they had the high ground, and as long as they could keep them supplied, they could actually do damage. And what they did, what the Lochamei Gush Etzion did, is that they would go out at night and do these raiding parties on the Arab Legion, and they were causing them a whole lot of trouble. And as a result, that's why, even though the Arab Legion on policy wasn't attacking any Jews until the British left, they were able to justify attacking Jews here. And this is the story of Kfar Etzion. This is the story of the Gush Etzion. The Gush Etzion. Okay, so on the other side of the line, what's happening? Ben Gurion is after the 29th of November 1947, in the months leading up to when the British finally left. The biggest question, among many questions that Ben Gurion, the biggest political question that they actually had, was whether or not to declare independence as soon as the British left. And this was a major, major question for them. And the sentiment was, the thought was, that if we declare independence, and that day the Jordanian Arab Legion comes in and overruns Yerushalayim, the independence, the state is going to be stillborn, right? That doesn't mean that the state was going to be extinct, but there's nothing more demoralizing and delegitimizing than a state that declares itself, and a minute later, the capital city, the city, the place that they're intending for it to be its capital, and the biggest group of its citizens ends up getting overrun. So that was not an option. So the thought was that what was not possible was one of the many factors that went into the decision to declare independence. One of the many factors that went into it was whether or not they were going to be able to hold the Western Yerushalayim. And they just realized that the only way to hold if they couldn't hold Western Yerushalayim, they could not declare independence. And if they couldn't declare independence on the day the British left, who knows if it was ever going to happen. This was a legitimate concern. And so that meant that the linchpin to the Declaration of Independence was the ability to hold Yerushalayim. And the linchpin to holding Yerushalayim was the presence of Jewish soldiers in Gush Etzion. Okay, so that's why Tzahal came to the decision to maintain its presence, that small garrison, in this four little block of settlements in 1948, in May of 1948. And they spent 2 months in skirmishes with the Arab Legion. They were able to resupply them very, very minimally. I mean, Israel had like a couple of Piper Cubs right? You could these were hundreds of people that they needed to supply, and they didn't have the means to supply them by air. So very, very minimally, they were besieged by the end on all four sides, and they actually at one point made the request leading up to May 14th. They made the request to evacuate, and the request was denied by the leadership of the Haganah. Days later to be inaugurated as Tzahal. And the reason why is because this was a political and military consideration. The only way they could save Yerushalayim and then declare independence was if they held off the Arab Legion until the British left. And so this was an extremely significant thing. And because of that, the Gush Etzion settlements ended up fighting to the last man. To the last man, there was everybody recognized Rehov HaLamed Hey. Right? Rehov HaLamed Hey was named after a convoy that was never made it to Gush Etzion. 35 people who were there to relieve and resupply the Yeshuvim in Gush Etzion were ambushed by the Arab Legion and massacred. And it was originally 38, but one of the people in the convoy sprained an ankle, and two of the people helped that guy go back, which is why it ended up being 35, and that's Rehov HaLamed Hey. So that was one of many attempts, most unsuccessful, to resupply this garrison in Gush Etzion. So they stand till the last man, and they mamash are there till they fire their last bullet, and when they are left just throwing rocks, and they realize they have nothing, there's nothing left they can do. There's 130 fighters left, and it's in Kfar Etzion, and they decide they have no choice. They have nothing to defend with, and they bought as much time as they possibly could. This was on the day before, right? This was on Thursday. So they go and they raise a white flag, and all 130 fighters gather in the center of Kfar Etzion, and there's some debate. Historically, different sides claim different things. Tzahal says, the official Israeli version of this history, is that the Jordanian Arab Legion and local irregular soldiers, local thugs, local residents came and they massacred all 130 of these people, or 127 of these 130 people. The Arab Legion claims that their presence there was to try and break up the massacre, and that they got there too late, which is why the local hoodlums are the ones that actually, the local irregular soldiers that did the massacre. But what is clear is that the brave soldiers of Gush Etzion, on literally the last day, the last moment, the very last thing that happened before Hakamat Medinat Yisrael, the last thing was the brave and heroic stand of these 130 people who literally laid down their lives and fired, and protected Yerushalayim until their last bullet was fired, until it became completely untenable before. And in the end, they were hoping to be taken prisoner, but they ended up giving their lives because of the animals that gunned them down after they had surrendered. So, Merchavia, a year later, knows this story because there were a few survivors, knows this story. And he knows that or at least he strongly believes, and Benny Morris certainly corroborates this based on other sources. He strongly believes that Medinat Yisrael, that the Hachrazat Ha'atzmaut never would have happened, couldn't have happened if Yerushalayim wasn't held, and Yerushalayim never could have been held without the brave soldiers of Gush Etzion. So that's why it's not just a symbolic recognition that there's no way to have Medinat Yisrael without recognizing the sacrifice that goes into it, which is of course true. But Merchavia said, and again, Morris points to a bunch of sources in which he makes this claim as well, is that the early iterations, this early, very organic and bottom up formation of this day of remembrance that we have this week started because it was also the day that Gush Etzion fell. And there was no day to commemorate Jewish bravery and Jewish sacrifice, Ba'ad Medinat Yisrael and Artzeinu HaKadoshah, than the day in which the Gush Etzion fell. And this was a part of, it's part of the, national, national lore. It's part of the national identity, national mythology. And after the 6 Day War, one of there was a huge effort and a huge movement to start to resettle and reestablish Jewish presence in the lands over the Green Line. And no. And the only people that Eshkol couldn't say no to were the 50 children that were the children of that were sent out of Gush Etzion 19 years earlier, when their parents fought and died for Medinat Israel. So they were within months of the 6 Day War ending, Gush Etzion was resettled, and there's and we have Yom HaZikaron today. So I think, first of all, I think everybody needs to read this book. So I'll plug it one more time. But Gush Etzion today is a memorial, and it's part of Gush Etzion, which was a few hundred religious Jews who were trying to make a go of it in Eretz Yisrael and died for their devotion. But Gush Etzion is part of the DNA of our beloved country. And as we are reciting our Azkarot this week, I certainly think that at the very least to understand this history and to understand this background is essential to understanding what the day is. Okay, that was longer than I intended, but it was. I think it's powerful and necessary. We're going to do a very, very quick skira of the other part of Sefirat HaOmer that I wanted to talk about. If Yom HaZikaron, starting from the request of all those parents of fallen chayalim, if Yom HaZikaron is a day that is supposed to accentuate our connection and our togetherness, our achdut, our unanimity, which is sometimes, unfortunately, far too elusive in this complicated place, I think that Sefirat HaOmer and the mourning practices of Sefirat HaOmer are another place to look to. Okay, so we'll start with what is a fairly well-known Gemara. Why is it that we have practices of mourning during Sefirat HaOmer? Students of Rabbi Akiva. What happened to the students of Rabbi Akiva?
They died.
They died. Okay, and they died. Why? They did not. So there are actually two versions of this. The more well-known version is the Gemara Masechet Yevamot, which is in page 4, source number 3, precedes source number 1. I apologize about the numbers. Amru. This is a very cryptic Gemara, and the history behind it is even more strange. But we're going to go through this very quickly. Amru. 12,000 zugim talmidim hayu lo Rabbi Akiva nigvad ad antipras. So there were 12,000 pairs of students. Strange thing number one is that we're talking about a great number, and this statement in the Gemara is the story that's being told. It's not even a Breita, it's not led with the Tanya, it's Amru. It was said of, right? It was introduced that way. There were 12,000 pairs of students. Okay, so we can do the math. That's 24,000 people, presumably, but there's something there. Zugim Talmidim, and these 24,000 students. They were there. They were spread out from Gvat ad Antipras. Those were Roman names of places. They were under Roman occupation at the time. And if you look at a map, I meant to include one. I didn't, but it was basically the north-south boundaries of the land of Yehuda. Right. This is basically the entire. It's like saying from New York to LA. Right. Spanning the entire north to south region of the country where Jews lived. So what does that mean? It means that he had these tens of thousands of students, and they were spread out throughout the entire Yishuv, Jewish population in the land of Israel. And so what do we know about them? They all died. Number one is that they all died. Number two is that they all died b'ferek echad. Right? Every one of these students died, and this Gemara is emphasizing this. They died in the same time period. Why did they die? Another interesting thing. If I had a board here, I would say, in terms of bullet points of things to point out from this Gemara. Number one is that it's referring to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is a very, very important piece of this. Number two is that we're referring to his students. Number three is that we're referring to pairs of students. Number four, I think the number is significant, but we're not going to get into that tonight. Number five is that they all died. Number six is that they all died within the same time period. And number seven is the justification for their dying. And the Gemara says because they were not noheg kavod zelazeh. They did not accord honor to one another, whatever that means. Okay? The land was desolate. Ad shabar Rabbi Akiva etzel rabotenu shebadarom. Shina lahem. Until Rabbi Akiva came south and taught his new students in the south. And the students were Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua. Right, so these students end up being, these students and Rabbi Akiva are actually the most quoted and established names throughout the Mishnah. So this is kind of like another one of these. I won't say mythologized, but another one of these legendary stories about our founding. If you're studying Torah Sheba'al Peh, these are household names, every one of these people. And we're saying their origin was basically a rebuilding after this mass plague that killed out all of Rabbi Akiva's students. So the picture that's being painted was a land that was full of Talmidei Chachamim, full of teachers and students of Torah, and they all died. Okay, last point in the Gemara, two more points. Tana, in the third paragraph, Kula meitu mi Pesach le'ad atzeret. So until now, before, all we knew is that it was beferek echad. It was in one time period. Here, we're identifying that time period. When was it? Between Pesach and Shavuot. And then last point, Amar Rav Chama, Barabba v'tim Rav Chia Baravin, Kula meitu mita ra'ah. They all died a grisly, horrible death. Maihi, what was this horrible death? Amar Rav Nachman, Askara. Askara. So I think the translation here says diphtheria. I don't know if this is diphtheria. The Gemara in Pesach Shabbat actually elaborates on what Askara was. It was some sort of disease or infection or inflammation of your throat. Okay, and that's what diphtheria is. But diphtheria is a bacterial infection, which people don't usually die from anymore because it's bacterial and we can treat it. But that's why translators have concluded that it was diphtheria. Okay, so we have this Gemara. This Gemara is, fairly well known. It's quoted lahalacha in the Shulchan Aruch that we have we have customs of mourning during this period of the year because of the students of Rabbi Akiva that perished. So my question is, I have a million questions on this, but my question is, this is about as cataclysmic outside of the Churban, okay, which had happened. Presumably, right, Rabbi Akiva lived through the Churban. Rabbi Akiva was born around the year 50-ish. It's a big fat estimate, but based on when he lived and at what stage of life he was at different points. So Rabbi Akiva was a young man at the time of the Churban HaMikdash, but he still was able to recall it at the end of his life that he was a farmhand, Rabbi Akiva, in the farm of Kalba Sabua, who was one of the wealthiest people in Yerushalayim at the time of the decades leading up to the Churban Beit HaMikdash, and he was a Toshav Yerushalayim, and he says at the end of his life that he remembers as a young man seeing the majesty and beauty of the Beit HaMikdash. This was at a time when he was an ignoramus, Rabbi Akiva, because he had his own personal journey. Okay, the thing that I'm so fascinated by, among many here, is that this is like as cataclysmic of an event as we can see, and yet it is recorded a total of 3 times. And 2 of them are obscure and nobody even knows about them. 2 of them are midrashim that nobody even reads. By comparison, and again, I don't want to compare the death of the students of Rabbi Akiva to the Churban, but the number of places, the number of times that the Churban Beit HaMikdash is referred to throughout Chazal is we're talking in the dozens. And the Gemara is constant. The theology behind it, there's a bunch of opinions in the Gemara all over the place that the Yerushalayim and Beit HaMikdash was only destroyed because of this reason or that reason or this reason or that reason. There's long stories in Masechet Gittin about all these different things that led up to the Churban, and yet we're given a total. This is one of the. It has to be like when I've spoken about this Gemara in the past, I used to say in the States, I would say, imagine if every college professor in the entire country died within a span of a few months, right? It's not like knowledge would be completely gone, but a good chunk of it would be, and like it would be, we would be in real dire straits about how anybody would be educated anymore. That's kind of what happened here. That a system of learning and studying that for whom these people were its backbone, and they all died. And it's not like the Talmud Bavli and the Mishnah is it's not like a treatise on farming or economy. It's about Torah and halacha, all right? The teachers of Torah and halacha, about whom there's immense amount of material about their biographical things, and it's always side points, but we're given huge amounts of biographical sketches of these people, and yet every single one of them died, and we know nothing about it. So it's only mentioned this here. So right off of the bat, this seems very, very cryptic to me. Never mind the fact that the statement itself is very cryptic. Where's the theology behind that? Like the way that there's so much theology in Chazal about trying to understand the Churban. None of it. But the Gemara does say what the Gemara says, and interestingly, this was a minhag that was very, very early. Now, we can't get into it now, but the Rambam strangely doesn't record it, even though it was already an extant minhag in the time of the Geonim. the times of the Gaonim, from approximately the 8th to the 10th centuries in Bavel, and this is after the period of the Gemara closed, there was still a period in which the central area of studying and teaching Torah in the world was in Bavel, as it had been for the previous 4 or 5 centuries. So it continued for another 2 or 3 centuries, and that was known as the period of the Gaonim. And we have very few works, although we have some works from the period of the Gaonim. And some of the most fascinating works that we have are responsa from the Gaonim. People sent the Gaonim of Bavel questions about Jewish law and practice from all over the Jewish world, from as far as Northern Europe to questions would be sent to Bavel. And one of the questions that was sent is in the source and the bottom of number 4, bottom of page 4. Okay, this was in a collection of Tshuvot that was actually published around the year 1800, known as Shari Tshuva. And Shari Tshuva is just a collection of a few hundred of these responsa that were published from the times of the Gaonim. So this is a very early practice. The Shulchan Aruch recorded the forerunner to the Shulchan Aruch recorded his practice of, which is where the Shulchan Aruch presumably got it from, recorded his practice already in the 14th century. So this is probably 300, 400, 500 years preceding that. The question was asked. Ushisha'altem, lama ein mekadshin ve'ein konsin bein Pesach la'atzeret im machmat isur olah. The question was asked of this Gaon in Bavel. You asked me, why is it that we don't have weddings in the period between Pesach and Shavuot? And has the status, our inability to have a wedding, has the status of a prohibition? And the response is, on top of page 5 now, it's not a prohibition. Minhag avelut. What is it? It's a custom of mourning. Why do we have a custom of mourning? This is already in the times of the Gaonim. Shekach amru chachamim, because the Gemara, he's quoting the Gemara here. 12,000 zugim talmidim hayu lo Rabbi Akiva, v'chulam meitu bein Pesach la'atzeret ad shelo nagu zelazeh. Doesn't say kavod. So they weren't behaving with one another, and they all died between Pesach and Shavuot. V'tani Allah v'chulam meitu mita meshuna ba'askara. And they all died from the punishment from the sickness of Askara. And from that point, from the time of this plague, where all the students of Rabbi Akiva died, all right, Rabbi Akiva is, again, living in the 1st century, right? So this is very early, 1st century, early 2nd century. This is extremely early. From that point on, this Gaonic sage is speaking 5-6 centuries later. From that point on, there was a minhag that developed not to get married during this point. Okay, that is the earliest source that we have that points to our customs of mourning that happened during Sefirat HaOmer and gives this as an explanation. And you'd think that fine, that's the home run, and we now know the basis of this minhag. My problem is manifold. My problem number 1 is that this is an extremely cryptic Gemara to base on minhagan. My problem number 2 is that, think about the questioner. If anybody's ever studied any of Professor Chaim Soloveitchik, so he made a science out of understanding sociological and halachic parameters and Jewish practice based on using as a historical source questions being asked. So the questioner, what's the questioner asking? The questioner is asking, we have an extant minhag. Everybody knows it, that I don't get married between Pesach and Shavuot. I just like to know why, or what's the basis of it, and if there's this isur. Now, if I asked anybody here, now granted, this is not a bulletproof argument, but if I were to ask everybody here, as I did, why is it that we have these practices, everybody would be able to answer that it was because of the death of the students of Rabbi Akiva. The thing, it was understood part and parcel. What's the questioner coming? Where's the questioner coming from? The questioner is saying, I see this practice, but nobody around where I live seems to know what it's about. There's just a practice. And the Gaon in Bavel gives the suggestion, it's not an Isser, it's just a minhag, and it's 500-600 years old, and it's based on the death of the students of Rabbi Akiva. But it sounds like it's possibly speculation. Okay, and why am I mentioning this? Because if you look in the next source, again, it's like our 5th or 6th source number 1, on 5. This is Aruch HaShulchan. This is a much later source. Aruch HaShulchan, Rabbi Michael Halevi Epstein, writing in the late 19th century. He is quoting previous sources, and that's why I brought him here. So the first paragraph is when he says that the basis for the customs of Avavilut are the death of the students of Rabbi Akiva. The second paragraph, V'od ra'inu she'ikare yemei hagzirot b'shnot me'ot We have a tradition, or we have a historical record, that the massacres that happened during the Crusades, starting in 1096 and going through in the 11th and 12th centuries, the Crusades and the massacres that happened through the Crusades happened during these months. How do we know that? From the piyutim, the liturgical tefillot, the liturgical poems that were written by the great sages of the past. Al Shabbatot elu shebein Pesach le'atzeret. These Shabbatot have piyutim that were written by rabbanim from the 11th and 12th centuries, and they describe the massacres that happened as having happened in the spring. The Hemleim kinim haga. And they are full of dejection and horrible stuff. And there's another suggestion. He gives two suggestions other than Rabbi Akiva. Number one is that it's a commemoration of massacres that happened in the 11th and 12th centuries. And number two is that it is that they are known as Yimei Din. Now we have the practice already existing from at least the time of the Gaonim. So that's preceding by several centuries the Gzeirot of the massacres of the Crusades of the 11th and 12th century. So presumably that's not the core of the minhag. But what this is telling us is that at least was a sentiment. There was no universally recognized basis for the minhagim of Avilut. Okay? There was no universally recognized basis, and then he even throws in at the end. The Chavas Yair mentions that there's another suggestion that it was Yimei Hadin. If you open up the halachot of the Abu Draham, he actually makes the argument that this period of the year, which was what are we doing during Sefirat HaOmer? It is in the times of Beit HaMikdash. It was the reason why we had the Hanafat HaOmer, the reason why we had a korban that was brought daily at the Beit HaMikdash out of the barley harvest is because this is the period of the year of the barley harvest. This was the grain harvest period of the year. The fruit came months later. It came a month and a half later. That's the Chag HaBikurim. That's Shavuot. But at this period of the year is the barley harvest. And while people can live without fruits and fruits. People can live without their apples and oranges. What they can't live without is bread. So the grain harvest was an essential for the well-being and prosperity of the land. And that's why these were, according to Abu Draham, considered to be Yimei Adin already already in the Midbar. HaKadosh Baruch Hu was establishing mitzvot that were there to highlight the significance and the fear and trepidation and the seriousness and the heady status of these days, because these were days which were Yimei Hadin, judgment on our farm crop, the farm crop that was most essential to us. So there's rain and grain are the two most important things to a civilization to be able to live. And so I'm assuming those two explanations are things that we've not. There's a few more explanations that are found in the Mefarshim. Why am I mentioning this? It's almost universally understood and codified in the Shulchan Aruch that the basis for these Nihugei Avelut are the death of the students of Rabbi Akiva. But there's enough ambiguity there, based on, I think, the asker of the question in the times of the Gaonim, and the fact that there was other explanations that were given, that it's not 100% clear. There's at least enough gray area there to say that I don't think that it's the most glad explanation that can happen. And part of what I attribute that to is the cryptic Gemara that we're basing this on. It's 3 lines, it's 3 or 4 throwaway lines in the Gemara that Chazal never felt the need to mention in any other place, anywhere in the Mishnah or anywhere in the Gemara. And this is Rabbi Akiva we're talking about. All right? And these are the students of Rabbi Akiva we're talking about, and yet you have no mention of it anywhere. Okay, so just to conclude, right? I'm going to say one final idea and conclude. So we spoke about Yom HaZikaron and the request of the mothers of the fallen Chayalim, and talking about how these the essential thing is that we have one recognized day. We have one day in which everybody is observing, because on this issue there needs to be achdut. I would say that the story of Rabbi Akiva's students, whatever its basis or whatever its its historical foundations may be, I would say that the story of Rabbi Akiva and his students is highlighting this as well. And I'll just point to a few of these details. Number one is that we're referring to these people as zugim. Okay, these are pairs. The idea is that we're trying to highlight here that these are people that naturally fit together, are supposed to be together. They are students. They are gathered under the banner of one person, of one teacher. Okay, whether it was really 24,000 or whether that's that's the Chazal's way of just saying a really large number, I don't know. But we're talking about lots of people who theoretically, or ostensibly, should have been able to be gathered under one banner. My main teacher from yeshiva, is publishing his first book in a couple of months. And this is actually really nice. There's been a bunch of emails that have been sent out to all of the Talmidim that were in his shir over the many years that he's been teaching. I was zocheh to give the Chazar shir one year, so I was part of another email chain of just the people that gave Chazar shir. It was like a super exclusive group. So there's this banner that I was looking at the names. This is a wildly different group of Jews, and yet there really is like this shared, this shared affinity, this shared identity based on all being students of the same person. So you'd think that there's this natural thing pushing everybody together, and yet, lo nagu kavod ze bazeh. The thing that's emphasized is that they were noheg with one another, but they were not noheg b'kavod. They were not noheg b'kavod. And again, I have many ha'arot on this. I'll just make one more. Askara, or diphtheria, I think is not, if it is diphtheria, or at least based on the Gemara in Pesach and Shavuot, that talks about how it's an inflammation or an infection of the throat. I think that is a fascinating coincidence, that the thing that did all of these people in, where they were mistreating everybody, was compromising their ability to actually speak and communicate and interact with one another. And I don't think, if none of this is a coincidence, then I certainly don't think that's a coincidence. Okay, so what's the deal between Pesach and Atzeret? So we could point about the fact, like the Abu Draham points out, that, and the Chavos Yair and the Aruch HaShulchan makes reference to that it's Yimei Adin. It could be that, because I don't think that. By the way, I should point this out. In the Rav Yaakov Emden has a siddur in which he gives the Siddur Beis Yaakov, and he gives a bunch of commentary on different things. And in his discussion, in his commentary on Sefirat HaOmer, he actually says that the reason why he puts these opinions together, and he says the reason why all of these students of Rabbi Akiva died specifically in this parak, in this time of year, is because this is Yimei Hadin. This is Yimei Hadin in which Klal Yisrael are supposed to be together, and they're not. And that's why, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu was choosing a time to punish them all, he chose this point. Okay, so I'll just add my own one final ha'ara to this whole picture. I think that in addition to it being a time of the grain harvest, Sefirat HaOmer, in addition to being a time that, in addition to it being a time in which, at least at the very least, this historical event, in addition to being a time when the historical tragedies of the Crusades may have happened, as is also mentioned by the Aruch HaShulchan, it's also the period that is the aftermath of Pesach and leads up to Shavuot. That's what Sefirat HaOmer is. When we read the Pesukim, we're out of time now, we read the Pesukim last week, already in the Torah Shebechtav, already in the Torah, we have to ask these questions, like, how is it presenting Sefirat HaOmer? What does this have to do with Pesach, and why is Shavuot presented as basically being the 50th day of the Omer, and how there's a bunch of korbanot that are brought on this 50th day, presumably like as the next step after these 49 days of grain harvest korbanot, and then based on those korbanot that are brought, we have a holiday that's Mikra Kodesh. Right? It's usually Mikra Kodesh that demands korbanot, not korbanot that demand Mikra Kodesh. Why is it that we have it in this direction? Why is it that this is happening? So I'll make the suggestion that what happened in the first Sefirat HaOmer, we weren't farming. God was establishing rules for when we become farmers. What was happening though? It was the time between our birth and our national creed, and that's really the title to the whole series, right? The birth, the origin story of Am Yisrael was a time in which they were coming from the status of slavery as a rabble of slaves who couldn't control anything about their own lives, to being people who are B'nai Chorin and freely accepting upon themselves their constitution, right? That was a 50-day period. That was a 49-day period. What is there to focus on? If you're somebody who wants to focus on essentials, okay? You can't have 15 essentials. You can have one or maybe two. And it's interesting that in this period of the year, that we're the Yimei Adin, this period of the year that HaKadosh Baruch Hu chooses to punish and punish these very, very important figures among the Jewish people at a very tenuous time, mind you, and he chooses to punish them because they're mistreating one another. I think that this is a time in which our core value, maybe the most core value that we are meant to highlight, is supposed to be highlighted at this time of year. Why? Because these are our founding weeks. They were the days and weeks that are commemorating our origin story. And the most important aspect of that was Vayichan Sham Yisrael Neged Ahar, Ki Ish Echad B'Lev Echad. The idea was that in the weeks leading up to Matan Torah, the weeks leading up to the Constitutional Convention, right, that we needed to establish and experience togetherness, Achdut. And there's no more important aspect of Achdut. There's no more important aspect of Achdut than knowing how to treat one another with derech eretz. Why is it that Rabbi Akiva's students thought? Why is it that Rabbi Akiva was the author of the statement that V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha was the most central aspect of Torat Hashem? And it was because he was about this, or if he wasn't originally about this, he became the person that was about this. And he realized that if we don't have B'nai Torah, if we don't have people who are Ba'alei Derech Eretz, we don't have mention, then we have nothing. So it's not only a time of Yemei Adin, it's not only a time of the grain harvest, it's not only a time where just historically something happened, it's also a time that we are here to commemorate and re-experience our origin story, which is meant to be rooted in dignity, interconnection, and respect for one another. And without that, we have nothing. I think it's as important of a message for the students of Rabbi Akiva and in their time as it is for us today in our fraught and complicated Medina Yisrael. We'll leave it at that. I'll take your question, but we'll... go ahead.
I mean, if Rabbi Akiva had 12,000 students, and he
24,000.
24,000
pairs.
Yeah. Surely he was aware that this was going on amongst his students, that there was no respect between them.
So
if he was close.
So I'll respond that it's either what your question, which is my question, is either shedding light on the historical mystery of this story, or it's highlighting a development of Rabbi Akiva himself. Rabbi Akiva, maybe, like I said, wasn't necessarily about. If you read some of the origin story, passages about Rabbi Akiva, it says in the early days that he actually uses the term sinai, that he hated the Chachamim. When he originally, in the first decades of his life, rejected Talmud Torah, it says that he hated the Chachamim, and that's why he couldn't engage in Talmud Torah. So maybe there's room to say that there was development on Rabbi Akiva's part, and he learned his lesson, and he saw he was filling the heads of his students, masterfully probably, but he wasn't filling their hearts.
It also might have been Muhammad Schus. We see that by Shuolim Hilchubo in the Churban and destruction of the.
There's a lot of Rabbi Akiva is the paragon of positivity.
Yeah, so maybe he saw goodness in the students, and he didn't see what ultimately did them in.
What was actually going on underneath.
But it's an essential question, which I think underlies the mysteriousness and strangeness of this whole thing. I hope that we had a little bit of a reflection on Yom HaZikaron and a little bit of a reflection on Yemei HaOmer, and I look forward to next week continuing. Thank you everybody for coming. Have a good night.